Hello, I'm Beth Felder, Chair of the Hopkins Museum's Advisory Board. Today we are here at the Homewood Museum. I am with my daughter, Grace, and we're here to get a sneak peek behind the scenes introduction to an upcoming exhibition here at Homewood called If Homewood's Walls Could Talk. We are so fortunate to have leading us through this exhibition, our Curator of Collections, Michelle Fitzgerald. So Michelle, thank you. Thank you so much for having us today and making the time. To start, I'd like to say, this feels like a different type of exhibition than we've had here at Homewood in the past. And I'm wondering, how did this come about? What was your inspiration for this new exhibition?
Absolutely. It is definitely a different exhibition than what we've done in the past. And in part, that's because we have two big anniversaries coming up in 2026. So the first is the nation's 250th, right? Mm-hmm. But then it's also Johns Hopkins University's 150th anniversary. So we wanted to create an exhibition that honored both anniversaries, which is kind of a tall order. So we decided that we would turn it over to the house to tell its own story for the first time. Homewood will be giving the full narrative of all its different eras throughout this house-wide exhibition. And through its own story, we can tell the story of Johns Hopkins and the story of the United States. So yeah, it's quite the exhibition for that.
Oh, terrific.
Now, Michelle, I'm someone who works in museums as well, and I'm curious, how did you decide, what rooms were going to cover what eras and, how, what objects would go in these rooms?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question because it's definitely something we were thinking about very early on with this. And what we knew we didn't want to do was have the rooms sorted chronologically. So there would be a set visitor path. You can experience the rooms in any way you want. Each room represents a different period of Homewood's history. And the reason we did that is because we, as people, don't remember things in chronological order. At least I don't. Mm-hmm. And so we wanted that sort of experience of memory and the house's memory to happen inside the exhibit as well. Also, though, we have visitor considerations to make, right, when you're going through these rooms. And considerations for the interpretive context of each era. So there's some rooms that have a key archival photograph of an era that takes place in that room. So we want to situate that period in that room. But then we also have spaces where that room might have been more significant in that specific period of time. And then we have spaces that just suit those objects better, where a visitor can come a little closer to them, experience them a little bit better. And we want to be mindful of that too. So there were a couple of different things at play for which era got which room.
Cool. That sounds like a lot of planning. When did you start this? How long of a lead time do you need to get to a final project like this?
Yeah, so Hopkins Museums, generally we set our calendar about 4 or 5 years out. And then about 2.5 years out, we start the research phase for that exhibition. And then about 1.5 years out is when we really kick into high gear. That's when the staff starts really putting a plan together, putting all the communication, the marketing, the development comes in, our programming, what we're going to do for it. And we do this for both. So we don't like to play favorites. We have an exhibit at Homewood this year. Next year, Evergreen gets an exhibit. And we go through the rotation like that. So it's quite a while, and we're always thinking about what's next in the calendar.
Cool. I can't wait to get started and see the whole thing. But what's happening in this room? Is there something special for this exhibition?
This is actually a good, when we were talking about visitor considerations and spaces, this is a good room for that because we're going to be talking about the colonial revival in this space. This room in particular was curated by a class of students. You will see this as a theme throughout this exhibit. Johns Hopkins University runs on its undergraduates, right? Absolutely. And we wanted them involved in this exhibition. So they pop up in a bunch of different ways throughout.
Oh, awesome.
This room, we had a group of students working on it. So I knew that there would be maybe more objects, more interpretation, more labels that were going to be happening. And so we wanted to give the visitor a lot of space.
Which this has.
This is our biggest room. Yes, exactly. So we wanted to do that. But also, the colonial revival at Homewood was a period of time where Homewood actually has its first incarnation as a museum. So in 1928, the Friends of Art do a temporary exhibition here. And then in the 1930s, a man called Garvin, who is known for his furniture collection at Yale, campaigns for remodeling of Homewood, a renovation of Homewood, a restoration, and creates a museum here for a while. So both of those exhibits prioritized decorative arts and American decorative arts, which wouldn't necessarily have actually been at Homewood in 1801. But that's not really the point of the colonial revival movement. It's more about a nostalgia for that past among an elite community of people who are looking towards the past for comfort. They're freaked out by urbanization and industrialization.
So this was happening all over the country?
It's a movement that's happening nationally. And so you see this rise, especially among wealthy white Americans, of collecting early American furniture in particular, but you see quilts, textiles, ceramics, things like that speak to American history. When we actually look at Homewood's history in 1801, they're pulling a lot of objects from England. They're pulling some stuff from France. They're going to be purchasing a little more internationally to show off their culture. And the colonial revival, they're going to be focusing in on America to show off their culture in the same way, but in a different period of time.
Fascinating. We're all going to learn a lot.
Yeah. So just to show you one object that's here, I will tell you that we don't have all the objects at Homewood yet who are going to be in the exhibit because they're actually at the Johns Hopkins Conservation Lab right now and getting ready for their big debut and their big display. But I have a couple of things to show you.
Okay,
one is in this room, and it's these birch prints right here. They're actually views of Philadelphia, and they come from an engraving book that was done by William Birch. He was English born. He settles in America. And you have these incredibly romantic landscapes. This was selected by a student as a key part of interpretation because it's something that was put in during, I believe it's the Garvin Museum era. And they're highly romantic views of Philadelphia. I'm not seeing any dirt. I'm not seeing any discomfort. They're beautiful and they're so much fun to enjoy.
Really idyllic looking.
They're very idyllic. And I will say something fun about these. Not necessarily in the exhibit, but if you look, you're going to see a specific woman in white in a lot of them who pops up. So you can have a little bit of a Where's Waldo moment when you're going through the exhibit too.
Thank you.
Of course.
Lead on.
Yes. I know we're talking a little bit about rooms and the different choices. So I'm going to take us to our next room where that choice was really driven by a single photograph. So we're standing in a room that visitors today know as the drawing room, but in the 1890s, early 1900s, this was a classroom. And the reason we know that is there's this wonderful archival photograph of this room and a bunch of boys in here at their desks, a teacher in front of them. And that was sort of the inspiration of why we wanted to put this particular era here. And that school is today known as the Gilman School, right down the road. But at the time that I was here at Homewood, its first home, it was the country school for boys. And it all started because this Baltimore woman, Anne Gilbreth Carey, wanted to send her son to a school, but she wanted him to come home at the end of the day. And in the country day school movement that's happening at this time, there's a transition away from boarding schools to these schools that were day schools and were in the countryside because Homewood in 1890s and 1900s is in the countryside. And so the boys could leave their house in Baltimore in the morning, come up here and have a education that was very well-rounded, where they would be outside, they'd be doing sports and activity and getting that country air here at Homewood. And then they could go home in Baltimore at the end of the day.
So Gilman's a familiar name on the Hopkins campus. What is the connection, or was there a connection between Johns Hopkins and Gilman?
Yes. So the Country School for Boys does change its name pretty early on in its run to Gilman School. And it is named for Hopkins' first president, Daniel Coit Gilman. And they do that. He is involved a little bit in the school, but, maybe not enough to necessarily get the school named after him. But they do that to sort of establish that educational connection. Gilman's very well known for education, right? Of course. And so having the Gilman School gives that sort of recognition as well.
Interesting.
So I gotta say, looking around this room, it's very ornate, very fancy. It's hard to imagine a group of school-aged boys in here.
Yeah, I don't know if I would do it today. But that's a great observation. Even though the Gilman boys, apparently they were respectful of Homewood and the historical space in that time. You can see their evidence and their mark on the house in our privy outside of Homewood, where they've left some graffiti. But what you're looking at today is actually the product of the 1987 restoration. So I mentioned some restorations earlier. This is the big one that happens in the 70s and 80s. And it's done by a committee of people made up of curators, collectors around the Baltimore area. Some are nearing retirement, some are just starting their career, and they're led by two women, Nan Pinkard and Aurelia Bolton. Homewood didn't have an inventory taken of it in 1825 that's comprehensive of the house because, and that's when the first resident passes away. Generally speaking, you would expect an inventory where they go room by room and you get the furniture and you get all these details. In 1825, the house wasn't occupied full time when he passes away. And so the inventory is incomplete. And so they don't have the same stuff to go off of that you have with some of these other historic houses that are being restored around the same time. So what they do is they look at inventories from everywhere in Baltimore. They look into research into daily life. They're doing research in England at times too. They're looking internationally at this to get as accurate image as you would have in that period as you can. And I will say it's held up pretty well over time, but time does move on after 1907. And you can see little traces of that, like with these paint colors, which in the early restoration, they did do a scientific analysis where they take a paint chip and they look at the different layers of paint under the microscope to figure out the original color of paint that this house would have had. And they found it and they painted the house. And then 20 years later, they do it again and they come up with a different shade. And so the house is repainted and that's the colors we're looking at today. And I think what that shows you is even with thorough research, science progresses, new archival records come to light, and that's why historians are still employed today.
Wow. And this was a group of volunteers, right?
Yes. Yeah, they were volunteers. There was one staff person for Homewood who served as the curator for this. And that group we felt was very important for this exhibition, I think, because of that in part and the work they did.
Yeah, I think we think of them as our founders almost. One of the really nicest things about being on this board has been getting to know some of those people over the years. It's just, they're so interesting and so dedicated. And I mean, frankly, I probably never would have crossed paths with them otherwise. My professional life was not in the museum world. And it really has been a privilege to get to know them and learn things from them that I didn't even know were things to learn. So
I completely agree with those that I've been lucky enough to meet. They've all been very charming and fun to talk to. I think that's why we really wanted them to ground this exhibition. Mm-hmm. So while each room captures a different era, the hallways that connect all of these rooms are about the restoration, so that you learn about that gradually as you're moving through the house, because that's really what we're looking at today. That's what these rooms are, is that 1987 product. And we wanted to make sure that they were a thread throughout the house. One of the things about this exhibit that I'm really excited about that's going to be here in this hallway are these QR codes that you'll be able to scan and hear an oral history from two of the people who were involved in this restoration. And these oral histories were done just for this exhibition. So they were just done last year, and it gave us the opportunity to also add to Johns Hopkins Oral History Project a component of Homewood's history. So we'll be hearing from Susan Tripp, who was the curator at the museums and oversaw the restoration. And we'll be hearing from Stiles Colwell, who was a young curator on the restoration and has wonderful memories of working with everyone.
Oh, fantastic. Those are two of the special people I've met over the course of the past few years.
They're pretty wonderful.
That I cannot wait to hear them.
Yes. So our next step is going to be the Best Bedchamber, which looked a little bit different about 50 years ago.
Wow, this really is an impressive bedroom.
It really is. And there's a reason for that. You know, even without the furniture here, you could tell that this was a bedroom in the early 19th century. At that time, bedrooms were more semi-public spaces, so you would want them to look nice. And you can tell with this really beautiful cornice and this medallion in the center of the ceiling, which is actually a copy of the one on the front portico out there and is at the same height. So you have this really impressive piece of architecture. And that is probably why in 1930s through 1970s, this room actually serves as the president's office for Johns Hopkins University. And that's the period we're going to be interpreting in this space for the exhibit.
Okay, cool. And so what period is that?
Yeah, it's a busy one. There's a lot that happens with Hopkins at that time. So when this is the president's office in the early 1970s, we see the first class of undergraduate women on campus. And so they remember this as the president's office. When this was the office, you had a lot of global events going on. You had the civil rights movement, you had the Vietnam War, you had a lot of things that students really wanted to engage with.
Yeah, I've heard there were some student protests that went on back in the day. Would the president have been able to just see them sort of right from the window?
Oh, yeah. So actually, when we had President Gordon here, Homewood was actually referred to by some students as Fort Gordon. And he would be able to see the protests right out this window here. There was a couple of different student protests that happened during this period. But I think the one that really stayed with me when I was doing research was when John Guess and Bruce Baker, who were the founders of the Black Student Union, are submitting these requests for more equality on campus. And they're submitting them, and the administration isn't necessarily giving attention to these requests. And so John Guess and Bruce Baker walk through the doors of Homewood and deliver the 10 demands in person to seek that equality on campus, which is just this beautiful emotional moment, I think, in Homewood's history. That's really incredible.
So what, do we have artifacts or particular objects from that period that are going to be featured in this room?
We do, actually. My favorite object in this exhibit is going to be featured in this room. So I'm so happy you asked that question. And it is a skirt that was worn by Mindy Farber, who was part of the first class of women. And it was a skirt she wore as a student. It's this very epic sort of velvet 70s piece, but it just gives you an idea of these students as individuals and their lives on campus, and the experience of this as the center of the Hopkins administrative campus.
Yeah, and that was a big deal when Hopkins finally admitted women. I went to school here as an undergrad, started in the early 80s. And at the time, I thought that 5 or 6 years that, had passed since they first let women in was a long time. When you're 18, 6 years is a third of your life. And when I got here, I actually found it was still a pretty male-dominated institution. The bulk of the students were still men. Some ways prepared you for some aspects of the real world back in the day, but it's interesting that that's going to be featured. I'm really excited about that too.
Well, and you mentioned time, and I think speaking of it, I think we should go back a couple hundred years and talk about the first generation that was here in the dining room. So we're here in the dining room, which is going to be the space in the exhibit where we talk about the Carroll family, our first generation here at Homewood, and that era the house is interpreted to today.
So Carroll's a name you hear a lot in Maryland. Which one lived here?
Yeah, that's a great question, and definitely a name you hear quite a bit in Maryland. And that is because the family is well known for Charles Carroll of Carrollton, the signer of the Declaration of Independence for Maryland. He was one of the 4 signers, and they were some of the largest landowners in Maryland and some of the largest enslavers in Maryland. His son, Charles Carroll of Homewood, they're all called Charles. So Charles Carroll of Homewood is the person who lives here with his wife, Harriet Carroll, their children, and with several enslaved families are here as well during a fairly brief period of 1801 to 1816. And the reason that's so short is it's a very tumultuous period for that family who's living here at Homewood. The Carroll marriage ends in 1816, and Harriet Carroll leaves for Philadelphia, and Charles Carroll of Homewood goes to Charles Carroll of Carrollton's house at O'Regan. And the enslaved families who are here are in some cases split up, in some cases stay together. Most cases they do stay together, but whether they are sent to Louisiana or whether they go to Philadelphia and are eventually freed is a lot of different stories.
Mm-hmm. How do we know their stories?
We're thrilled to include in this exhibit a ledger from O'Regan Manor, which was Charles Carroll Carrollton's house. Mm-hmm. And it's in the care of the Howard County Historical Society. And we got in touch with them a couple of years ago, and they had this ledger, but it wasn't in a condition where researchers could use it. And when we come and take a look at it, we realize that's actually the names of the enslaved on O'Regan, which in this time period also includes people who are going to be here at Homewood in the 1830s. And it's their clothing allotments. So we get a sense of little details about their life from that and the family units that were there. So the mother, the daughter, the father, where they're located at that time when they're in this ledger. We were very happy to connect with Howard County Historical Society for this. Our conservation lab actually stepped in. They cleaned up the ledger. They got it digitized, and now it's available to a lot of researchers who want to access it to learn more about their family history. And so it's available digitally, and it's going to be featured in this exhibition.
Nice. So we're sort of contributing to the scholarship of the whole field, in a sense, by doing this.
Yes, we're definitely doing that. And we're contributing to family individual histories too, which has been, I think, a really meaningful part of this exhibit is when we get to do some of those conservation projects.
Mm-hmm. So what other objects will be featured in this room?
Yeah, so there's a couple of cool objects coming in. We are going to have one of our favorite objects in this collection, which is Charles Carroll of Carrollton's writing desk. And it's actually a portable writing desk. So it's sort of like your 18th century laptop. And it has the Carroll crest on it. And for an individual who is so connected to what he wrote in history and what he signed in history, the idea of his writing desk being something that is preserved over time and connected to him kind of speaks very well, I think, to the concept of a legacy and nostalgia. We're also in this room going to include a brick that was used in the building of Homewood that's found in one of our archaeological digs that happened a couple decades ago. And talking about not only the named individuals who were enslaved at Homewood, but the unnamed ones who were working as bricklayers to actually build the bones of this house, which was built very likely with enslaved labor. Then, speaking of the house, we are going to also have a 1738 copy of Palladio on display here. Homewood is very well known for its Palladian architecture. And really, I think the most important piece of our collection is the house itself. And because of that, I feel like we can't do an exhibit on the history of Homewood without starting with the book that it comes from in some ways. So we'll be seeing Palladio here, which you don't frequently get to see.
You mentioned Charles Carroll of Carrollton's writing desk. Is that something that has been in the house for a very long time? Or how did it come to be at his son's house?
That's a wonderful question. And I think speaks a lot to object sort of histories, their own histories, right? And so we don't know any objects. We can't identify any objects that were here at Homewood because of the limited documentation of the inventories and archival records of the objects that were here. So we couldn't speak to any of them. We have several Carroll pieces. But I think now that they're here at Homewood, Homewood has become part of their history, and that 1987 restoration is just as key a part of their history as that first generation that they were here. So I think your question really speaks to a lot of the themes of this exhibition, that these objects are capable of telling stories, and the stories they tell may not be the stories we assign to them. And when we listen, these sort of other threads start to unravel. So we're listening to the house for this exhibit, but I think all these objects will be speaking as well.
Fantastic. What a great concept to come up with for these 150th and 250th anniversaries that have coincided. I think people are going to really enjoy it.
Well, thank you so much. I think, we've started at the beginning of Homewood's past, but maybe we'll move into one final space and talk a little bit about Homewood's present. So in this space, we're doing something a little bit different and talking about Homewood today, where it's running as a historic house museum. So we're going to turn this space into a museum worker's office that visitors are welcome to sit at the desk, look through some of the notes that we're going to have here, and contribute through an interactive that we'll have set up their own story and to Homewood and their own relationship to Homewood. So we're going to turn the story over to our visitors to talk about the present.
So we've seen that Homewood has led so many lives. I mean, it's been a home, it's been a school, it's been office space, and now it's a museum and a historic home. And it's really been interesting to me because I was fortunate enough a few years ago to work at Mount Vernon down in Virginia, and that's really had two identities. It was a home and then it was a historic home. But this is very different. And I guess I'm wondering that while you were putting this exhibition together, did you think at all, or did you ever, ponder sort of how the journey of Homewood reflects sort of changing attitudes that we as Americans feel about historic homes and sort of what they represent and what we use them for?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And I think that's why Homewood telling its own story is so important, because historic houses don't just exist in that period where they were first created, right? We interact with them today for our own perspectives, our own feelings on them. And they've gone through so many lives since then. And those layers of history are visible in the bones of the house. You see it here at Homewood, even if it's, a small detail like some graffiti in the privy, or something maybe not super romantic like the installation of the ladies' bathroom. These are changes that happen to this house that tell you the history that happened here and that evolution of American history. And I think that's a really important thing for us as Americans walking through these historic homes to think about, is all of the individuals who came before and left their mark on the property.
Mm-hmm. And it was probably important to those people in that moment, what they were doing here. So it makes sense to go back and revisit that and make sure we're not skipping parts of our story. Absolutely. In a sense. Well, this has been amazing. And there's so much here in this exhibition. Thanks so much for being so generous with your time today. I think we both really, really learned a lot. And thank you for joining us as well. I hope you got a little taste of behind the scenes of what it's like to be in a museum and to craft an exhibition, and that this has whet your appetite to come and see the exhibition this fall when it opens. And also come back to Homewood again. There will always be something new here for you. You'll always be welcome. Thank you.
Hello and welcome again. I'm happy to now be joining you live as we shift to the Q&A portion of our broadcast. I've already seen a few great questions come in the chat, which I'm really excited to answer in a second. And we should have time to really dive into those. Please continue to leave your thoughts and questions in the chat. I'll do my best to respond to as many questions as I can. And first, we have a couple of questions from Juliana on the Johns Hopkins University news team. And her first question is, what was the initial inspiration that led to the conception of If Homewood's Walls Could Talk, A History of an American House? And that's a great question. We definitely had, we knew these two big anniversaries were coming up. We wanted to do something for them. But we also, over the years, have had many discussions about Homewood, the house, and how this house has such a story and such a presence on the campus in American history for American architecture. How do we share that history with people? And we felt that this was a really good time to really let the house take center stage and tell stories from its perspective of its entire life. And she also asked, how do you see this exhibition contributing to ongoing conversations about history, identity, and sense of belonging at Johns Hopkins? I'm going to lump that in with her third question. How does this exhibition fit into the broader celebrations of Johns Hopkins' 150th anniversary and the nation's 250th? And both of these are great questions. And we wanted, when we created this exhibit, to make sure that we were contributing to the anniversary, the celebrations, but also to another layer of the history of the university. And something that was really important for me to get across was that this house's history, and therefore, as we look at that micro history looking bigger, the house's history, the campus's history, the nation's history is all made up of the actions of these individual people and their individual experiences and their own sense of identity and connection to the spaces they lived in, worked in, or even just moved through or by. And we wanted to encourage students who go to the university right now, as well as people coming back and visiting, to really empathize with some of these people that they're going to hear from and the exhibit, and think about how they themselves are a part, just by existing, of a historical narrative. Sam asked a question about the graffiti left in the Homewood Privy. He asked if there are any archival images of what it looks like on the inside. And I love this question because it allows me to kind of give a shout out to the Historic American Building Survey, which is available for free at the Library of Congress website. You can find those images. And there's some lovely images of the inside of the Privy that were taken by the Historic American Building Survey and available there. We did use those images. They did help a little bit when we were working on the restoration of the Privy recently. But also, if you would like to look at that graffiti yourself, I encourage you to look through the windows of the Privy. I will warn you that it is schoolboy graffiti and a little bit spicy sometimes. Cindy asks about the room that is going to be interpreting the president's office. Are you swapping out the bedroom furniture for period 1970s office furniture? And that is a great question and a really good point to bring up. No, we're not. This is supposed to be an overlay of history on the rooms, and that's really an intentional choice on our part. We wanted, for one side, on the practical side of things, we wanted our visitors who wanted the general tour of Homewood that they can get today to still be able to access that tour during 2026. But also, a point I really want to convey with this exhibit is that historic properties are not just one point in history. There are layers of many different generations living on top of each other, and we're all living with sort of the impacts that different generations have put on this house. It's not just one period. And so I think the juxtaposition of objects from one period of time against the furnishings that we have in the house today might sort of reinforce that point. I have another question from Sam, who said, it sounds like there were a lot of objects and records for you and the students to parse through in creating this exhibit. Was that difficult? Were there objects you wanted to include but couldn't because of space and conservation concerns? And we actually had an interesting sort of situation with this exhibit in which it was quite hard in some ways to find objects that really spoke to the time and to individual people. I'm very personally grateful to our university's University Archive, to Hopkins Retrospective, to Special Collections, and our conservation department. So the libraries really pulled together on this one to help us track down a lot of these objects that were either already in our collection or were available through private lenders. So that was a massive help in locating objects for us to really use and consider. There are a couple of dream objects I would always love to see. One of them you sometimes get to see at the Baltimore Museum of Art, so you just have to go across the street to see it. And that is a chair that was produced by the Finley brothers in the early 19th century, and it has a painting of Homewood on it, and that's sort of the first time we really see a visual image of Homewood in history. And it's a beautiful chair. I don't think it's out right now. Sometimes it is out though. And there's a couple of other, that suite has a couple other images of other Baltimore houses from the period. So Ben asked, being a home of a notable family, I'm sure some notable guests have passed through the home's doors. Are there any records like that or folks we recognize? Yes, there are some records that we can use to track down who's been through Homewood. We do have just your regular old-fashioned guest book from the early years of Homewood as a museum, so the 1980s, early 1990s. But then we also have resources like letters, newspaper, other things that come up in archival record that help us figure out who's moved through this house. I would say over the years, some of our big names were, we had President Eisenhower, like President of the US Eisenhower, visiting his brother, President of the University Eisenhower, at Homewood. And we have a wonderful account of that in one of our oral histories. We also have Alice Warder Garrett that we know was involved in an exhibition in 1928 here. And she may not sound like the big fame to everyone else, but she is the resident of Evergreen Museum and Library, which is our other museum. So we had these opportunities to create really unexpected and beautiful connections between the two houses. I have another question from Sam. He loved the photos of the outside of the museum and asked, were there ever gardens outside the home, like at Evergreen? Are there any photos? There was a really interesting situation for gardens at Homewood. But yes, when this house was first built, it was very much so a country estate. The city really grows up to Homewood, not Homewood being built in the city initially. And there's been a lot of research over the years on what that looked like. We know there was an orchard. We know from some archival record that there was an orangery at one point, several outbuildings. Right now, the Privy is our only, I shouldn't say just the only surviving outbuilding. We have the Privy and we have the carriage house, which is now used as the theater space at the university. But the privy really gives you an idea of what the back of Homewood looked like initially, where we think there might have been sort of a crescent moon layout of outbuildings around the house, which is very, organized, very Palladianism in many ways. And in the front, I think you have seen more of a romantic landscape. So thinking about those English country houses, the winding paths that afford you glimpses of the house. And that's really the genre that Homewood would fit into with that. Sophia, who has some experience with nonprofit galleries, was curious about the expense of conservation and how an exhibition like this is funded. For this exhibition in particular, we were very fortunate to receive funds from the university's 150th group. And that really allowed us at Homewood a unique opportunity that we don't always get to make sure that we have everything these objects need for display, to have exhibit furniture. So like cases, reader rails, like things like that come in and elevate this exhibit in a new way. We are very reliant on private donations to keep our exhibitions going at both museums. And I think you can really see the result at Homewood right now. Monice asked, for the families of the enslaved, has there been any family tracing to see if there are family members still in Baltimore or Philadelphia? Great question. I have to give credit to the descendants on this rather than anyone on our staff who has been doing this research. We have been reached out to by descendants of people who were enslaved by the Carrolls, and we are actively working between all the other houses, other Carroll historic properties in Maryland to create a relationship with our descendant community. I will give extreme credit to Carrollton Hall on that in Howard County, Maryland. So that's we have a couple Carroll sites in Maryland, and the work and connections that they are doing with that. But that's very much so a connection that we are really enthusiastic about having. I have a couple more questions from Juliana. When curating this exhibition, what guiding principles shaped your decisions, and how did you determine which stories to highlight and which to leave aside? That's great. So for us, there were a couple, for Homewood's exhibition here, because we had so many different student curators coming in, we really did need to have a very firm set of principles for each room to guide each room and make sure we had a consistent voice. And so I really reinforced that we were looking for objects and histories that spoke to Homewood's stories of education, resistance, and power. Those are three themes that sort of naturally come out of Homewood over its lifetime. You see that through the eras sort of popping up pretty consistently. And that was sort of our way of finding stories that we felt were very relevant to that, that very organically come up. I also am very grateful for our students and their research for this exhibition. I think seeing what objects and what stories specifically spoke to them was also a really helpful drive in figuring out those narratives and what we wanted to see. Regarding the audience, how does this exhibition fit into the broader celebrations of Johns Hopkins 150th and the nation's 250th? What do you hope visitors, namely students, local community members, or the broader public will take away from this? What I would really like to see visitors take away from this is a sense of ownership of their own landscape, their city, their historic sites and community. Homewood is not just living in the past. This is a house that's still alive. It's still being used today. It's had many different purposes. People have experienced many emotions, many memories in this house for good or bad. And that's important that we look at the ongoing life of these buildings, these objects, these sites, and think about that while we're celebrating and looking back on these upcoming really exciting anniversaries, we are also looking at many stories of these specific people that are affected by a greater history, or are impacting it themselves, and how that shows up physically on in our own world. All right. So it looks like that's all the questions that come in today. I would like to thank Beth and Grace again for joining me. We had a lot of fun filming this. And of course, everyone who tuned in to listen to today's presentation on this remarkable collection and this wonderful house, and for asking so many wonderful questions. Our next Lunch with the Libraries and Museums event will be Friday, October 3rd, featuring Max Zalen with the presentation From Heidelberg to Baltimore, What Johns Hopkins University Owes the Oldest German University. To register for this and other free virtual programs, visit hopkinsathome.jhu.edu. Thank you again, and I hope you have a wonderful afternoon.